Welcome to the 007 Files. I'm Javi Trujillo, and I'm here with my co-host, Bill Koenig. Today, we are thrilled to be talking to the author of the upcoming Felix Leiter novel, The Hook in the Eye, Mr. Raymond Benson. Thank you for joining us, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, Javi. Thanks for having me on, and hi, Bill. Hello, podcast land.
We are very excited to have you on today. It was about 2 months ago that the IFP announced your new novel, and from the press release, Ian Fleming Publications have just announced the digital serialization and subsequent paperback publication of The Hook in the Eye, a full-length novel penned by Benson that focuses on Felix Leiter. Set in 1952 between Ian Fleming's Live and Let Die and Diamonds Are Forever, this is a mystery, a romance, a spy story, a road trip tale, and a postcard of a lost Americana. This full-length novel will be released digitally in 10 installments beginning on May 27th, recalling the serialization of classic pulp fiction in the early 20th century. This will be followed by the paperback publication of the full story on October 2nd. So, bedside companion aside, you've been regarded as a modern-day Bond continuation author, and Charlie Higson was a period James Bond author. And now cut to the 2020s, and you've both flipped roles. So tell us about how this came about. And am I correct in my understanding that you started work on this over a year ago?
That is correct. I have, ever since I had done the Bond novels in the late 90s and the early 2000s, I had entertained in my mind a Felix Leiter novel. I've always felt that he was a very rich character in the original Fleming novels, but never really explored adequately, I guess, in the films. And I've always, we'll probably talk about the films a little bit, but I don't think we've ever seen Fleming's version of Felix Leiter on screen. And I pitched it a couple of times to Ian Fleming Publications over the years since my Bond tenure. And it was just never really in their wheelhouse or fit in with what they were doing at the time or wanted to do at the times. But lately, you may have noticed that they've started to do some spin-off type stuff, like Kim Sherwood's 00 Agents series, and there's going to be a Q novel by Basim Khan, also published this fall. So I thought, well, gee, maybe I could pitch it again. So I did, and this was last spring, and they were very enthusiastic about it this time. And after, kind of then developing a full proposal for it, and turning that in with a sort of a, sketch storyline and how I wanted to do it and that kind of thing. I got the green light, and I mostly wrote it over the summer last year, doing all the research and writing it. And then it kind of went into editing mode in the fall, and then went to the board of directors in December. And it was approved in January, and ever since then, we've been, working on the marketing end of it and how they were going to do it. They wanted to do a serial from the beginning. They were looking for something. They were looking for something that, they wanted to, I guess, from what I understand, they wanted more people to visit the website, their website, ianfleming.com website. At first, we thought maybe it would be a serial on the website, but I don't know if that was possible. I don't know what happened, but it became an ebook that in the US you can buy it from Amazon or Barnes and Noble if you have a Nook or whatever, and then the file gets updated every 2 weeks with the new episode. That's how it works. If you're in the UK, you get it directly from IFP, and then the paperback comes out in October, right? So yeah, it's kind of a complex experimental way of doing this, but that's what they wanted to do, and we're going to see how it works.
I was about to say, way back when, Charles Dickens wrote serialized stories that were then collected into novels.
Right. Well, James M. Cain back, doing, I think Double Indemnity was a serial that appeared, or maybe it was Postman Always Rings Twice. I can't remember which of his novels was a serial first. So, there is a sort of a tradition of this sort of noir mystery, pulp, hard-boiled stuff coming out as serials.
Yeah, it's kind of back to the future, so to speak.
Yeah. Not that this book is a hard-boiled pulp fiction kind of story. It's more in keeping with what Fleming was writing, whatever you would call that. Yeah. In the 50s. I don't call Fleming hard boiled. I don't call Fleming, even, he might be pulp fiction, I guess. He was probably considered that in the 1950s.
Yeah.
But that's not what this is. This is a mystery, just like what that tagline said. It's a mystery. It's a spy story. It's a period piece.
I like that the release model keeps the engagement going. I don't know if you've paid attention at all, but it's been a while since we've had a James Bond movie. But the publication side seems to, be keeping engagement with the fan community with all the different books that you mentioned. And so I like that this isn't just going to come out. We'll talk about it for a week and then it's gone. Like there'll be continued discussion and keep it in the eye around longer. So that's kind of a interesting way of changing the model and releasing it this way.
Yeah, and we're also adding some extra value content to the website, to Ian Fleming's website. Some videos and some essays that'll appear throughout the summer about Felix and about the process. For example, how on TV shows, series, sometimes they have an unpacking the episode little video at the end where the actors talk about it or the creators talk about it. We're doing that after every episode. A week later, we're going to have a little video of me talking about the episode and maybe the research that went into it and that kind of thing. So that's going to happen after every episode.
Nice. I look forward to that.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of research, this is going into the weeds a little bit, but of course, people who know Felix just through the movies have not really seen Felix with a hook.
Right.
And I was wondering if by having only one hand and a hook for another, does that affect the way he carries weapons or the way he does his job? To give you an example, on the old Hawaii Five-0 show, they had an episode where the guy had no hands. He just had two hooks. And the story itself was not that remarkable, but what made the episode remarkable, and people still talk about it, is the fact you saw this detail about how a man with no hands puts together his gun, carries the gun and all this. So, this isn't the same thing because Felix still has one hand, but
right.
Does that come into play in the depiction, in his depiction in your novel?
It absolutely does. I mean, how could it not? Because the story starts pretty much right after the shark mishap, and the very early part of the book is about his rehabilitation and getting prosthetics. And I had to do the research. Fleming didn't go into much detail about what the prosthetics were. He just called it a hook, and we didn't really know what that kind of looked like or anything. When I was a kid, reading the books for the first time in the 60s, I thought it was a pirate hook, a hook, which is not right. That's not what he would have had. He would have had what would be more similar to what Harold Russell had in The Best Years of Our Lives. And that's a pincher kind of prosthetic with a shoulder harness that operates with shoulder flexion. Felix would have been outfitted by the Veterans Administration because he was once a Marine and he was working for the government. And so that's where he would have gotten his prosthetics. And it was only just 5 years after Best Years of Our Lives. So the prosthetics would not have changed much. And I worked with a prosthetics doctor who knew the history of them. He told me exactly what he would have, and that's what we go into. So Felix has to learn how to, do that. And he was right-handed, so he has to learn how to shoot with his left hand, which is a big challenge for him in the book, in the story. Bill, our friend James McMahon.
Yes.
James has been my armorer for pretty much everything I've written since he was my major Boothroyd. And he knows the Fleming novels. He knows Felix. And I put him on the task, what would be the best gun for Felix after this, mishap with the shark? What would he use? James came up with a couple of possibilities, but we settled on the Ivor Johnson, which has a hammerless look. The hammer's kind of enclosed inside the gun. And we decided he would wear the gun on his right hip, hilt out, so that he could cross-draw with his left hand. And that way, it wouldn't be awkward, like if he was sitting down or driving a car. It would be awkward to draw a gun. He wouldn't be able to wear a shoulder holster anymore because he's got a shoulder harness for the arm. the prosthetics. So a cross draw from the hip just seemed logical and doable. So that's what I went with.
It sounds like you didn't have really much of a challenge finding period accurate research for this. Were there any obstacles in trying to research the prosthetic side of it, or?
Not the prosthetic side, not at all. I mean, once I found this doctor in my area who knew the history of prosthetics. You know, I mean, there are a lot of prosthetics doctors around. They might not know what was worn in 1952.
Right.
But this guy did, and he helped me, he helped me with that. A lot of the research was more of period stuff in the locations. I purposefully set the story in places where I've either lived or been to, and the challenge was what was there in 1952 and what wasn't, compared to what I knew of the place. So New York City is very much a location. The first third of the story takes place in New York, and I lived in New York many years. Then there's like a road trip in the middle section that goes from New York to Texas, and I've driven that route, the very same route, 3 times in my life. So I knew the route and I knew all the stops and everything. But of course, back then there were no interstates.
Right, yeah, because the interstate system didn't get started till 56. And
yeah, that's right. So this would have all been U.S. highways or state highways. But, the interstates were built either on top of those highways or right next to them. They were the same routes. And you hit the same towns on the way and all that. So the challenge was finding, what motels or hotels would there be in 1952, or what restaurants or, fast food stops would be there along the way on the road, that kind of thing. And that was a bit of a challenge, but I was able to do it. And then the last third is in Texas, and I'm from Texas. So yeah, it was fun.
When I told my daughter that I was going to be talking to you this morning, she wanted me to tell you hook 'em, as she's looking forward to going to UT in the fall, and she wanted me to bring that up to you.
All right. Yeah. Well, I went. I was there. I was there 5 years. I took a gap semester, so it took me longer to graduate. But yeah, that was one of the times of my life. I've had several, but that was one of the best. It was, my college years were A+. They were great.
What elements of Texas can we expect to see in the book?
Well, there's a big section in Dallas, and then there's a section in Odessa, and I'm from Odessa. That's where I grew up. Odesolation is what I call it. And and that's what Felix's father calls it too. West Texas is its own character. It's very desert-like and desolate. So Odessa was very small in the early 50s. I grew up there, I was born in Midland, which is its sister city, but we moved to Odessa when I was almost 5, late end of 4. So Odessa is what I really know. I knew growing up, and I went to high school there. I went to the Friday Night Lights high school. The movie and the TV show and the book, it was that high school that's written about, and the movie was about. That was my high school, Permian High School. Then I left. As soon as I graduated high school, I left. I always knew I would leave. The last part of the story takes place there, and then we kind of creep into New Mexico. Toward the end, the southeast corner of New Mexico plays a big role.
What was more challenging for you, to write Bond in the present day as the second ongoing continuation author, or to write Felix in Fleming's original timeline? What felt the most pressure?
The Bonds were definitely more difficult because, with the modern stuff, you got to learn all the technology that's present and things like that. But also I traveled to all these exotic locations that I'd never been to, and I had to do the research on these locations. The Felix was easier just because, there was also the whole British versus American thing. Mm-hmm. I was an American writing a British book when I was doing Bond, and I had to write British. They wanted me to write in the British idiom, and the first 2 books, really, it was a challenge. I had to really become British. And, Peter Jansen Smith, who was the chairman of, at the time it was called Glidrose, and then they changed the name to Ian Fleming Publications. Peter, would vet it, and kind of spot some Americanisms that crept in the first book or 2. And then the British editor at Hodder and Stoughton that published the books, she was really good at, vetting some stuff like that. So by the third book, High Time to Kill, I pretty much mastered it. I was feeling British, and I was going to England a lot during those times. I was flying over there 4 times a year and spending some time there. So the language was seeping into me.
Mm-hmm.
That was a challenge at the time. And then the plots were a different kind of plot than the Felix novel. The plots were very Fleming Bondian, complicated geopolitical plots, and you had to do a lot of research. It was a different time too. The internet was not what it is today when I was doing it. So a lot of information was not readily available at that time as it is now. Whereas now with the Felix, I am a Texan. I am an American. Felix is an American. He is a Texan. I felt like I was much closer to this character. I knew this character. I've known guys like Felix, men like Felix, and I felt like the voice was very familiar to me. And as far as the locations and all that, I knew them. So it was more the period. I had to research the period and bring the period to life. And that was the challenge.
You made mention earlier that we've never seen a proper version of Felix, at least Ian Fleming true version of Felix in the movies. I was going to ask you why you think that, but let me just preface it by saying about 10 years ago, I had a chance to read one of the Kevin McClory scripts. I think it was the first one because it was dated like January of 1960. And there's like a lot more Felix in it. He's still the number 2 guy, but just more Felix than I was used to seeing in the films. And I've seen some other scripts from the Eon series, not as much Felix as in that McClory script, but it was written by Jack Whittingham. But more Felix than you usually see, and it's like, I don't know, I get the impression like as they edit the movie, Felix kind of falls out. But why do you think that is, that they haven't done a true adaptation of Felix?
Well, I can't speak for, all the people who involved in the Bond series since 1962, but it's interesting that they put Felix in Dr. No, and he doesn't even appear in the novel.
Right.
So they knew at that time, well, Felix is this sort of important supporting character that will appear throughout the series. And, I bet, they originally wanted Jack Lord to probably continue being Felix, but by then he was too big. His stardom was starting to rise, and he wouldn't.
Well, actually, they did ask him back for Goldfinger, according to this was a Richard Maybaum interview, but he wanted a big raise and better billing, and they said thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah.
But already he had done a TV show right after Dr. No. That only lasted a year, but he was an in-demand guest star throughout the 60s. So
yeah. And Thunderball, the novel, that is Felix's biggest role in the Fleming books. He is in it quite a bit. There's 3 books where he's got a major role. That's Live and Let Die, Diamonds Are Forever, and Thunderball. Goldfinger's really a cameo. Casino Royale is a very small role, an important one, but it's very small. And then A Man with the Golden Gun is fairly substantial. It's sort of a medium-sized role. And he's only in 6 books, 6 of the 12 novels. But those major 3 books, he's very much a presence in the books. And Felix in the books, in Fleming's books, he is very upbeat. He is a buoyant, jovial joker. He's constantly, high energy, mansplaining to Bond America. Come on, we're going to go do this. We're going to go up to Harlem. We're going to, here's the menu of this great restaurant. You're going to order this, you're going to order that, and it's going to be great. You're going to love it. And this is the drink you got to have. This is a fantastic drink. Drink this, buddy. It's this kind of thing. In Diamonds Are Forever, he comes up, his appearance in Diamonds Are Forever, he comes up to Bond on the street of New York, sticks his hook in his back and goes, stick him up, He's a joker. He's kind of a goofball in a way. But he's a smart goofball. He's a great goofball. And he's never really been portrayed that way in the movies. He's never been this sort of, kind of funny guy in a way. And the way he and Bond relate in the books, they're always like kidding each other. And Felix is calling him "you limey" all the time, and stuff like that. And it seems like in the movies, Felix is a lot more serious.
Yeah.
Jack Lord was almost never smiled. I mean, I don't want to put down the actors. They're all fine actors, and I don't like to do that.
Well, they're doing what's in the script and what the director tells them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The scripts does not give them Fleming's. And of course, he's never been portrayed in the movies with a prosthesis, which I think is a shame. I wish we could have done that. They would have done that. You know, physically, the actor that resembles Fleming's Leiter is Rick Van Nutter, because he is tall and he's blonde, and he's the only one that is that of all the actors.
Would he be your favorite of the live actions?
Yes, I think Rick Van Nutter would be my favorite, just because of that. And he does have a little more rapport with Bond. A lot of people like David Hedison, and he's okay. I've always felt he seemed a little too old to be Leiter at the time. But again, I think he's more serious. He's not this sort of joker, buoyant, jovial guy.
Which is interesting because I never really thought of David Hedison as doing comedy or something approaching comedy, but he was in an episode of The Saint, which I only saw about a year or so ago. And it was like, he was quite funny. And he was,
Really?
Yeah,
I don't think I've seen that.
the episode's called Luella, and it's one of the black and white episodes. And it concludes with a James Bond joke. Anyway, so it's not to go too far afield, but it's if you're a Bond fan, it's probably something you should seek out. I don't know if it's still on Amazon Prime or not, but that's where I saw it. So
Yeah. Now, interestingly, Cease Linder in Goldfinger, he has more of a buoyant, jovial quality. He's always got a smile on his face all through the movie. That's my James,
That's my James.
and stuff like that. But he doesn't really kind of look like Leiter. He's not the guy I envision in the novels,
Yeah.
but he kind of has the attitude. He's almost there,
Yeah.
So I do like Cease Linder as Felix in a way.
Yeah, a lot of people think he was older than Jack Lord. He was actually like 3 months younger.
Really?
Yeah, well, Jack Lord played younger, and the producers ended up casting him, after Jack Lord didn't work out, so for Goldfinger. So
Yeah. And, and why did they cast somebody else for the next one? And why did they cast somebody else for the next one? I mean, the only guy that's played it more than one, well, two of them, David Hedison twice and Jeffrey Wright 3 times.
What flavor does writing this book in the first person bring to the tale?
Well, I think you get to know Felix better. You get to know his inner thoughts and how he's observing the world as we go through the book. Now, there's only one other first-person tale in the whole universe, and that's The Spy Who Loved Me.
Yeah.
And I thought this would be an interesting way to do it, approach it. IFP loved it. They just loved the way this has turned out. I think, yeah, it was fun. It was fun. I was putting myself in, Felix's shoes, so to speak, and becoming him. Or maybe he became me. I don't know.
What can you tell us about the romance aspect of the story? The solicit mentions a character named Dora, but could we possibly see the return or origin of Manuela Montemayor from The Facts of Death?
No, that's much later in the it's much later in the future. My Bonds were very late 90s, early 2000s, and I kind of consider them a separate bubble, even from Fleming's books. I consider all the authors, the continuation authors' books, as their own separate universe,
Okay.
I mean, they might have ties to Fleming's books, and that's really what has been our only directive from IFP was don't contradict Fleming, but do whatever you want. And so, John Gardner's books kind of took, a little, you can kind of think that that's the same Bond from Fleming's books. He's a little older, but they're really kind of their own separate bubble. I started off almost like continuing from John Gardner because I mentioned one of his characters or two in the first book. But then I stopped doing that. And then my 6 books, not counting the novelizations, are kind of their own little separate bubble. And I feel the same about Anthony Horowitz and all that.
Do you consider your Bond to be Fleming's Bond, or do you feel like it's more of a Fleming-Eon hybrid then? How do you look at him?
That's an interesting question. I feel like my Bond is Fleming's Bond, but the books themselves are a Fleming-Eon hybrid because that was my directive. When I first got the offer from Peter Jansen Smith to try to take over John Gardner, we talked about what we would do. Should I just continue contemporarily from John Gardner, or should we put it back in the 60s? Because I wanted to maybe explore that, 60s or 50s. And Goldeneye came out during our discussions. It was November of 95 when all this was going on. Goldeneye came out, and it was such a huge, huge hit that revitalized the whole series and everything. And so Peter said, no, well, because of that, I think we should stay in sync with the films. And in fact, we want you to make M a woman, just like the films. And if you can, try to put in a little more sensibility of the films into your books. You know, a little more action, a little more humor, make them more cinematic, that kind of thing. And I said, well, that's fine, but I want my Bond to be the guy from Fleming. I want him to have all of his vices intact. I want him to smoke and drink and womanize and all that stuff. And they said, that's fine, you know, if you can make it work. So I think, you know, my novels do kind of feel kind of like the movies in a way. The plots, though, I like to think are more Fleming-esque, but I think my Bond is Fleming's Bond. I hope.
Your last original novel, I think, was 2002. You also had a novelization of Die Another Day that year, and then you go off and you're doing, you know, your own characters and various other fiction, and then you come back to the IFP fold. What was that? I mean, you've kind of answered this, but what was that like? Kind of, you know, returning to the world of Bond after that kind of absence?
I didn't plan it, really. It's just that, I mean, we've always been in touch. We've always been friends. And, you know, my contract ended and they wanted to go on to other things back into, you know, at the end of 2002, because 2003 was the 50th anniversary of Casino Royale. So they wanted to stop the adult continuation novels for a time. They reissued all of Fleming's books. From America, they had those great Fahey covers that were really wonderful.
Yeah.
And then they wanted to explore the whole young Bond thing with Charlie Hickson. So that bulk of the decade of the 2000s was, there were no continuation novels until 2008 when Sebastian Faulks wrote his.
And it was the 100th anniversary of Fleming's birth as well.
Right. Yeah. Right. Right. So, you know, they've been doing all these different things, exploring ways to exploit the novels and other things. And now, you know, in the 2010s, they had even more Young Bond by Steve Cole, and then they had a couple of more authors, and then Anthony Horowitz's 3 books. And now, you know, they're branching out with Kim Sherwood's books and such. So me coming back was, for Felix, just kind of made sense because I am American and I'm a known quantity to them. You know they can work with me. I can work with them. We know we have a good relationship, and it just kind of fit. It just all gelled this time, and it's great to be back. You know, it's like I feel like I never left, but you know, I mean, you know, even 10 years ago, they were putting out my ebooks and stuff. So we were always in contact, and it's been great fun too.
And just speaking, you know, for me personally, like 0-10 came out when I was 20 years old. And for me, that was just a golden age of Bond from my perspective, because we had your books and they were alternating between the novelizations of the movies and your own original content, plus movies, plus video games. So I have a soft spot for your books in that era of Bond, because it was just such a big part of my life. And it's exciting that we're getting more novels from the IFP, and to have you back as, you know, writing a Felix book. Like, I'm really looking forward to that, and hopefully it won't be the last time. Never say never again. But do you have a preference now that you've kind of done modern day Bond and you've done a period piece? What do you prefer to write, and what do you prefer to read from that?
Oh, gee, that's a good question. Well, I read it. Are you talking specifically Bond universe?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I read everything that comes out, you know, officially from IFP, and I pretty much enjoy it all. I mean, we all have nitpicks and stuff like that, and I'm not going to go into them, but for the most part, I've enjoyed everything that comes out, just because it's part of the universe that I love. I think I really do like the period stuff. Maybe now more. I mean, back in the 90s and 2000s, having a modern thing was okay, but now it feels more correct to have Bond back then in the literary version. In a literary version, just I don't know, but the movies are going to be modern. The upcoming movies, whatever they do, what Amazon does, they're not going to do a period piece. I don't think. I wouldn't expect them to. It would be.
It would make the merchandising hard.
Yes, yeah, and the product placement.
Yeah, and that's a key part of it.
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
So I think Bond will always continually be updated to whatever contemporary time either the books or the movies are. But luckily, with the literary side, we can go back into the 50s and the 60s if we want. So, and that's always a nice thing to do.
Well, right now, IFP seems to have the option of going either way, depending on what they want to do, because they also had Charlie Higson do that novella on His Majesty's Secret Service. And that was set in the present day, and it has a lot of current references of the political scene in Europe and so forth.
Right.
But Horowitz's three were very popular, and they're obviously within the Fleming timeline.
Yes, they were good. I enjoyed those.
Bill, did you have any final questions before we wrap up?
Well, I thought I'd pose this question to other of our guests, so I might as well pose it to you. I was just kind of wondering, what was your reaction on February 20th when they made the announcement that Amazon was taking creative control of the Bond film series? And have your feelings evolved since then?
Well, I've kind of been expecting it. I know Barbara and Michael. I know them. And I didn't know that it was going to happen, but I was kind of expecting something was going to happen. In 2021, after I saw No Time to Die, I kind of thought, you know what? I think they're going to sell the franchise because that was such an ending. That was such an ending to the Eon thing that I didn't see how they were going to continue. I mean, but then it seemed like they were going to continue for a couple of years, 2-3 years, and then we got the announcement. Look, I'm encouraged by the choice of producers. I'm hoping, I'm not a doom and gloom person when it comes to this, like you've seen on the internet in some quarters. I'm kind of looking forward to see what they do. Why not? Let's give them a chance. Let's see what happens. It could be very, very exciting. I'm game to see what they do. Let's just put it that way.
One final question then that just kind of popped into my head. Of all the books all the Bond novels that you've written, is there one in particular, like if Amazon were to decide we want to adapt a continuation novel, is there one of your tenure that you'd be like, I hope they do this one?
High Time to Kill.
Yeah.
That is my favorite. And it's pretty unique when it comes to Bond stories. I mean, they've never really done a mountain climbing tale. So, this would be, I think, a pretty exciting and tense story, I'd love for them to do that.
Well, I agree with you about High Time to Kill. It's my favorite of your books. And one of the things I found fascinating was the detail on what you have to do, the physical training to actually climb. And if I remember right, you've got to take a pause like halfway up the mountain or so because, to acclimate your body to the thin air and so forth.
Right.
And I just found that fascinating. And it was great. It was a great story as well. I also know a late friend of ours is in it as a henchman, and he was, and I know from talking to him at the time, he was very proud of that. And he got the classic line, "Aye," as he falls off the mountain.
Yeah. He and I joked about that a lot because after his accident, I'd go over to his house. We're talking about Paul Bach.
Yeah.
Great friend of mine. And I'd go over and we'd watch movies together. And whenever some guy falls, he always went, "Ah!" We'd laugh about it, So that's why I put it in to make him laugh. And then he had this great line about once during a big blizzard in Chicago, he and his wife, they wanted to order Chinese food, takeout. And he called our favorite Chinese place and ordered. And the guy says, "Oh, you don't want Chinese food. Why don't you order a pizza?" Because it was a blizzard. It was like horrible outside. And so I put that in the book, that line where Paul Bach is like ordering, somebody's calling him about the food. And Paul Bach says, You don't want Chinese food. Why don't you order a pizza? It was an in-joke.
Well, Raymond, anytime that, not even just when I go to Chewy's, anytime I see a margarita, I always think in my head that it's a musical comedy drink. And I'm just excited that you're back in the Bond world, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk with us about the upcoming book. Just remember, everyone, it's The Hook in the Eye. It starts May 27th digitally. You can get it different ebook retailers, and the paperback is October 2nd. Are there any plans for a hardcover, or is it only going to be a paperback?
We don't know. Right now, it's just paperback. Yeah, because that's usually how they publish their books. You know, like in 2023, when we had that big Pinewood event to celebrate the 70 years of Casino Royale, they republished 0-10, the John Pearson authorized biography, and Kingsley Amos's Colonel Sun. And they all came out in this sort of paperback format, and that's how it.
I'm greatly looking forward to it. Again, thank you so much for coming on the show. That has been today's episode of the 007 Files, and the 007 Files will return. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.